The M4 Sherman, officially medium tank, M4, was the most numerous battle tank used by the United States and some of the other Western allies in World War II. The M4 Sherman proved to be reliable, relatively cheap to produce and available in great numbers. Thousands were distributed through the Lend-Lease program to the British Commonwealth and Soviet Union. The tank was named by the British for the American Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. The M4 Sherman evolved from the interim M3 medium tank, which had its main armament in a side sponson mount. The M4 retained much of the previous mechanical design but put the main 75mm gun in a fully traversing turret. One feature, a one-axis gyrostabilizer, was not precise enough to allow firing when moving but did help keep the reticle on target, so that when the tank did stop to fire, the gun would be aimed in roughly the right direction. The designers stressed mechanical reliability, ease of production and maintenance, durability, standardization of parts and ammunition in a limited number of variants, and moderate size and weight. These factors, combined with the Sherman's then superior armor and armament, outclassed German light and medium tanks of 1939 to 42. The M4 went on to be produced in large numbers. It spearheaded many offensives by the Western Allies after 1942, when the M4 tank went into combat in North Africa with the British Army at El Alamein in the autumn of 1942. It increased the advantage of Allied armor over German armor and was superior to the lighter German long-barrel 50mm gunned Panzer III and the short-barrel 75mm gunned Panzer IV then in service. For this reason, the U.S. Army believed the M4 would be adequate to win the war, and no pressure was exerted for further tank development. Logistical and transport restrictions, such as limitations imposed by roads, ports, and bridges, also complicated the introduction of a more capable but heavier tank. Tank destroyer battalions using vehicles built on the M4 hull and chassis, but with open-top turrets and more potent high-velocity guns, also entered widespread use in the American Army. Even by 1944, most M4 Shermans kept their dual-purpose 75mm M3. By 1944 and 1945, the M4 was inferior to German heavy tanks but was able to fight on with mutual support from numerical superiority and with support from growing numbers of fighter bombers and artillery pieces. The relative ease of production allowed huge numbers of the M4 to be manufactured, and significant investment in tank recovery and repair units allowed disabled vehicles to be repaired and returned to service. These factors combined to give the Americans numerical superiority in most battles, and many infantry divisions were provided with M4s and tank destroyers. A M4A3E8 variant was introduced with improved suspension and a high-velocity 76mm gun as used on the tank destroyers. After World War II, the Sherman, often in updated versions, saw combat in many conflicts, including the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli Wars, and the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. U.S. design prototype. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department designed the medium tank M4 as a replacement for the medium tank M3. The M3 was an upgunned development of the M2, medium tank of 1939, in turn derived from the M2 light tank of 1935. The M3 was developed as a stopgap measure until a new turret mounting a 75mm gun could be devised. While it was a big improvement when tried by the British in Africa against early German tanks, the placement of a 37mm gun turret on top gave it a very high profile, and the unusual side sponson-mounted main gun with limited traverse could not be aimed across the other side of the tank. Detailed design characteristics for the M4 were submitted by the Ordnance Department on 31 August 1940, but development of a prototype was delayed while the final production designs of the M3 were finished and the M3 entered full-scale production. On 18 April 1941, the U.S. Armored Force Board chose the simplest of 5 designs, known as the T6. The design was a modified M3 hull and chassis, carrying a newly designed turret mounting the M3's 75mm gun. This became the Sherman. The Sherman's reliability resulted from many features developed for U.S. light tanks during the 1930s, including vertical volute spring suspension, rubber bush tracks, and a rear-mounted radial engine with drive sprockets in front. The goals were to produce a fast, dependable medium tank able to support infantry, provide breakthrough striking capacity, and defeat any tank then in use by the Axis nations, though it would later fall short against the much heavier tanks developed by Germany. The T6 prototype was completed 2 September 1941. Unlike later M4s, the hull was cast and had a side hatch, which was eliminated from production models. The T6 was standardized as the M4 and production began in October. Doctrine: as the United States approached entry in World War II, armored employment was doctrinally governed by Field Manual 100-5 operations. That field manual stated, "The armored division is organized primarily to perform missions that require great mobility and firepower. It is given decisive missions. It is capable of engaging in all forms of combat, but its primary role is in offensive operations against hostile rear areas." The M4 was, therefore, not originally intended as an infantry support tank. In fact, FM 100-5 specifically stated the opposite. It placed tanks in the striking echelon of the armored division and placed the infantry in the support echelon. The field manual covering the use of the Sherman devoted 1 page of text and 4 diagrams to tank versus tank action out of 142 pages. This early armored doctrine was heavily influenced by the sweeping early war successes of German blitzkrieg tactics. By the time M4s reached combat in significant numbers, battlefield demands for infantry support and tank versus tank action far outnumbered the occasional opportunities of rear echelon exploitation. United States doctrine held that anti-tank work was primarily to be done by anti-tank guns. Speed was essential in order to bring the tank destroyers from the rear to destroy incoming tanks. This doctrine was not entirely followed in practice, as it would create an interval of vulnerability in the armored battalion until tank destroyers moved to the front. This made it harder for an armored force to achieve a breakthrough against enemy armored forces. It was also easier for an opposing armored force to achieve a breakthrough against an American tank battalion, which would not have all of its anti-tank weapons at the front during the beginning of any attack. The United States doctrine was less relevant in the Pacific, where tank versus tank battles were less common and where the light Japanese tanks were considerably outmatched by the M4. U.S. production history. The first production began with the Lima Locomotive Works on the assembly line set for tanks for British use. The first production Sherman was given over to the U.S. Army for evaluation, and it was the second tank of the British order that went to London. named Michael probably after Michael Dewar, head of the British tank mission in the U.S. It was displayed in London and is now an exhibit at the Tank Museum, Bovington, UK. In World War II, the U.S. Army ultimately fielded 16 armored divisions, along with 70 independent tank battalions, while the U.S. Marine Corps fielded 6 independent Sherman tank battalions, a third of all Army tank battalions, and all 6 Marine tank battalions were deployed to the Pacific Theater of Operations. Prior to September 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had announced a production program calling for 120,000 tanks for the Allied war effort, which would have created 61 armored divisions. Although the American industrial complex was not affected by enemy aerial bombing nor submarine warfare as was Japan, Germany and, to a lesser degree, Great Britain, an enormous amount of steel for tank production had been diverted to the construction of warships and other naval vessels. Steel used in naval construction amounted to the equivalent of approximately 67,000 tanks, and consequently only about 53,500 tanks were produced during 1942 and 1943. The Army had 7 main sub-designations for M4 variants during production: M4, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, M4A4, M4A5, and M4A6. These designations did not necessarily indicate linear improvement. For example, A4 did not indicate it was better than an A3. These subtypes indicated standardized production variations, which were in fact often manufactured concurrently at different locations. The subtypes differed mainly in engines, although the M4A1 differed from the other variants by its fully cast upper hull, with a distinctive rounded appearance. The M4A4 had a longer engine system that required a longer hull and more track blocks, and thus the most distinguishing feature of the A4 was the wider spacing between the bogies. M4A5 was an administrative placeholder designation for Canadian production. The M4A6 had a diesel engine and elongated chassis, but fewer than 100 of these were ever produced, while most Shermans ran on gasoline. The M4A2 and M4A6 had diesel engines. The M4A2 with a pair of GMC 6-71 straight-six engines, the M4A6 a Caterpillar RD1820 radial. These, plus the M4A4, which used the Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine, were mostly supplied to other Allied countries under Lend-Lease. M4 can refer specifically to the initial subtype with its continental radial engine, or generically, to the entire family of 7 Sherman subtypes depending on context. Many details of production, shape, strength, and performance improved while in production, without a change to the tank's basic model number. These included more durable suspension units, safer wet ammunition stowage, and stronger armor arrangements, such as the M4 Composite, which had a cast front hull section mated to a welded rear hull. British nomenclature differed from that employed by the U.S. A 24-volt electrical system was used in the M4. Early Shermans mounted a 75mm medium-velocity general-purpose gun, although Ordnance began work on the medium tank T-20 as a Sherman replacement. Ultimately, the Army decided to minimize production disruption by incorporating elements of other tank designs into the Sherman. Later M4A1, M4A2, and M4A3 models received the larger T-23 turret with a high-velocity 76mm M1 gun. which reduced the number of high-explosive and smoke rounds carried and increased the number of anti-tank rounds. Later, the M4 and M4A3 were factory-produced with a 105mm howitzer and a distinctive mantlet on the turret which surrounded the main gun. The first standard production 76mm gun Sherman was an M4A1, accepted in January 1944, which first saw combat in July 1944 during Operation Cobra. The first standard production 105mm howitzer Sherman was an M4, accepted in February 1944. In June to July 1944, the Army accepted a limited run of 254 M4A3E2 jumbo Shermans, which had very thick hull armor and the 75mm gun in a new, heavier T-23 style turret, in order to assault fortifications. The M4A3 was the first to be factory-produced with the option of the horizontal volute spring suspension system, with wider tracks to distribute weight, and the smooth ride of the HVSS. Its experimental E8 designation led to the nickname Easy 8 for Shermans so equipped. Both the Americans and the British developed a wide array of special attachments for the Sherman, although few saw combat, remaining experimental. Those that saw action included the bulldozer blade for the Sherman dozer tanks, duplex drive for amphibious Sherman tanks, R3 flamethrower for Zippo flame tanks, and the T-34 60-tube Calliope 4.5 rocket launcher mountable atop the Sherman's turret. The British variants formed part of the group of specialized vehicles collectively known as Hobart's Funnies. The M4 Sherman's basic chassis was used for all the sundry roles of a modern mechanized force. Roughly 50,000 Sherman tanks, plus thousands more derivative vehicles under different model numbers. These included the M10 Wolverine and M36 tank destroyers, M7B1, M12, M40, and M43 self-propelled artillery, the M32 and M74 tow truck-style recovery tanks with winches, booms, and an 81mm mortar for smoke screens, and the M34 and M35 artillery prime movers. Service history. Allocation during World War II. Approximately 19,247 Shermans were issued to the U.S. Army and about 1,114 to the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. also supplied 17,184 to Great Britain, while the Soviet Union received 4,102 and an estimated 812 were transferred to China. These numbers were distributed further to the respective countries' allied nations. The U.S. Marine Corps used the diesel M4A2 and gasoline-powered M4A3 in the Pacific. However, the Chief of the Army's Armored Force, Lt. Gen. Jacob L. Devers, ordered no diesel-engined Shermans be used by the Army outside the zone of interior. The Army used all types for either training or testing within the United States, but intended the M4A2 and M4A4 to be the primary Lend-Lease exports. First combat Shermans were being issued in small numbers for familiarization to U.S. armored divisions when there was a turn of events in the Western Desert Campaign. Axis forces had taken Tobruk and were advancing into Egypt, and Britain's supply line through the Suez Canal was threatened. The U.S. considered collecting all Shermans together so as to be able to send the 2nd Armored Division under Patton to reinforce Egypt, but delivering the Shermans directly to the British was quicker, and over 300, mostly M4A1s but also including M4A2s, had arrived by September 1942. The Shermans were modified for desert warfare with sound shields over the tracks and other stowage. The Sherman first saw combat at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 with the British 8th Army. At the start of the offensive there were 252 tanks fit for action. These equipped the British 9th Armoured Brigade, 2nd Armoured Brigade and 8th and 20th Armoured Brigades. First encounter with tanks was against German Panzer III and IV tanks with long 50mm and 75mm guns engaging them at 2,000 yards. There were losses to both sides. The first U.S. Shermans in battle were M4A1s in Operation Torch the next month. On the 6th of December near Tabor, a platoon attached to 2nd Battalion 13th Armored Regiment was lost to enemy tanks and anti-tank guns. Additional M4S and M4A1s replaced M3s in U.S. tank battalions over the course of the North African Campaign. The M4 and M4A1 were the main types in U.S. units until late 1944, when the Army began replacing them with the preferred M4A3 with its more powerful 500 horsepower engine. Some M4S and M4A1s continued in U.S. service for the rest of the war. The first Sherman to enter combat with the 76mm gun in July 1944 was the M4A1, closely followed by the M4A3. By the end of the war, half the U.S. Army Shermans in Europe had the 76mm gun. The first HVSS Sherman to see combat was the M4A3E8W in December 1944. Pacific Theater. While combat in the European theater of operations consisted of high-profile armored warfare, the mainly naval nature of the Pacific Theater of Operations relegated it to secondary status for both the Allies and the Japanese. While the U.S. Army fielded 16 armored divisions and 70 independent tank battalions during the war, only a third of the battalions and none of the divisions were deployed to the Pacific Theater. The Imperial Japanese Army deployed only the 2nd Tank Division to the Pacific during the war. Armor from both sides mostly operated in jungle terrain that was poorly suited for armored warfare. For this type of terrain, the Japanese and the Allies found light tanks easier to transport and employ. During the early stages of combat in the Pacific, specifically the Guadalcanal Campaign, the U.S. Marine Corps M2A4 light tank fought against the equally matched Type 95 Hargo light tank. Both were armed with a 37mm main gun. However, the M2 was newer by 5 years. By 1943, the IJA still used the Type 95 and Type 97 IHA medium tanks, while Allied forces were quickly replacing the light tanks with 75mm armed M4s. The Chinese in India received 100 M4 Shermans and used them to great effect in the subsequent 1943 and 1944 offensives. To counter the Sherman, the Japanese developed the Type 3 Kainu and the heavier Type 4 Kaitu. Both tanks were armed with 75mm guns, albeit of different type. Only 166 Type 3s and 2 Type 4s were built and none saw combat. They were saved for the defense of the Japanese homeland, leaving 1930s vintage light and medium tanks to do battle against 1940s built medium Allied armor. During these latter years of the war, general-purpose high-explosive ammunition was preferred, because armor-piercing rounds, which had been designed for penetrating thicker steel, often went through the thin armor of the Type 95 Hargo and out the other side without stopping. Although the high-velocity guns of the tank destroyers were useful for penetrating fortifications, M4s armed with flamethrowers were often deployed, as direct fire seldom destroyed Japanese fortifications. Post-World War II. After World War II, the U.S. kept the M4A3E8 EZ-8 in service with either the 76mm gun or a 105mm M4 howitzer. The Sherman remained a common U.S. tank in the Korean War, despite no longer being the primary U.S. tank. It fought alongside the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton. The M4A3E Sherman and T-34-85 were comparable and could destroy each other, although the use of high-velocity armor-piercing shells, advanced optics and battlecrew training gave the Sherman an advantage. The M4A3E Sherman, using 76mm HVAP ammunition, destroyed a total of 41 enemy tanks from July to November 1950. The lighter M4A3E8 tank became the preferred U.S. tank in the later phases of the Korean conflict. Due to the mechanical reliability of the M4, its ease of maintenance, and its drivability compared to the M26 tank, the U.S. Army replaced the M4 with M46 Pattons, an improved M26, during the 1950s. The U.S. continued to transfer Shermans to its allies, which contributed to widespread foreign use. The Israeli army used imported M4A1 Shermans during the 1956 Suez Crisis. About 300 Shermans were upgraded with the long high-velocity 75mm gun CN75-50 of the AMX-13 and were designated Sherman M50 by the Israelis. Before the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israeli army upgraded about 180 M4A3 HVSS Shermans with the French 105mm model F1 gun, re-engined them with Cummins engines and designated the upgraded tank Sherman M51. The Sherman tanks, fighting alongside the 105mm Centurion Shocal and M48 Patton tanks, were able to defeat the T-34 85th T-54 55 62nd series, and as three tanks used by the Egyptian and Syrian forces in the 1967 Six-Day War. M4A3s were also used by British forces in Indonesia during the Indonesian National Revolution until 1946, when they were passed on to the KNIL, which used them until 1949 before they were passed on to the Indonesian Army.